doesn't change size. It's perfectly, its angular size remains perfectly constant, and that's because it's a long way away, and of course the Earth is spinning. We can measure gravity simply by dropping something. It's standing on some scales. You can see there's an attractive force to the center of the Earth, and we know that if you move around, wherever you go on the Earth, it always pulls down. We can demonstrate gravity also in a vacuum, so we know that it's an attraction between masses, and we can measure this in experiments as well. But we know, if we put something on torsion balance, as Cavendish did many hundreds of years ago, we can establish that the masses attract one another. So this is the reason why, for instance, the atmosphere is held to the ground. And I think the question about why the atmosphere rotates with the Earth, because any body which is rotating and the liquids do support shear stresses. I mean, for instance, if I were to stick a ruler in some syrup, and I was to pull up the ruler, it would pull up with it some syrup around it. That is a fluid there demonstrating a shear stress.
Well, so syrup obviously has more viscosity than water.
That's right. Yes, yes, that's correct. So it's a question of degree. But similarly, the same thing happens, and we know. For instance, if you've ever, if you're next to something moving in air, say a car, for instance, and you are moving near that, you will be affected by that. If you're planes and things, as they move through the air, they also get shear stresses and boundary layers. For instance, it's a well-known physical thing, the body of science. For instance, if you pump water through a pipe, there is a shear stress on the pipe. If you have to put extra pressure in if you have a narrower pipe than you do if you have a wider pipe. So we know that shear stresses do happen in fluids, and it just so happens with air it's slightly less than it. Well, it's a lot less than it is with, say, syrup. So we know with fluids, and air is a fluid. It's a gas, but it behaves like a fluid. It conforms to the fluid equations, but it's just simply a much less viscous fluid than, say, syrup. And the reason you don't experience things like you were talking about what was simpler, the only reasoning you seem to have behind your whole thing was what's simpler. Well, I'm afraid life isn't necessarily simple. Quantum physics isn't simple, for instance. What you have to be, as Einstein said, you want the simplest explanation, but no simpler. And unfortunately, you seem to be going for much simpler than reflects reality. So, damn it, what was on? That was on the train. Yes, a train. So you were talking about an aeroplane. Obviously, just like in a train. I mean, if you were to throw up a ball inside a train moving at, say, 200 miles an hour, it would come back down in your hand because, of course, the train and the ball is going along at 200 miles an hour, and it doesn't lose that velocity. So when you throw it up, it's going at 200 miles an hour, goes up, and you can ignore the motion.
You're inside of a closed atmosphere, obviously. I don't know why people keep using that example.
Well, because the same is true of the Earth.
The Earth is inside of a closed atmosphere?
Yeah, it's effectively a closed system. There's very little. Do you understand the definition of a closed system? There are three sorts of systems. There's an open system where there's an exchange of matter and energy. Then there's a closed system in which there's no exchange of matter, but there is exchange of energy. And then you have an open system, and a closed system, which there's no exchange, or an isolated system. In which there is no energy or matter. So the Earth receives energy from the sun, but actually the matter exchange is so small, the matter coming in and out of the Earth is so small in comparison to the mass of the Earth, we can ignore it. So effectively it's a closed system. But it does have energy, so that's why it's not an isolated system. It receives energy from the sun, but it doesn't receive matter. Very negligible, so we can ignore it in effect. So similarly in a train, that's not actually a closed system because the air can come in and out of the train through the doors. It's not a vacuum seal or anything. So, but it's a similar scenario. So in a train or an aeroplane, you throw a ball up, it comes back down where it lands, and the same thing happens on the surface of the Earth with helicopters and aeroplanes. Effectively, and as you did accurately observe, the only force is equal to mass times acceleration. So if there is no acceleration, that means the velocity is constant. So then remember, that can be velocity is constant. It doesn't necessarily mean it's zero. So for instance, in space, if you were to fling something in space, and it would go along in a straight line until a force caused it to change its direction. So you need a force to cause a change of direction, and you can only feel forces. And to feel a force, you have to have an acceleration. So in a train, you only feel the bumps that are going along because you're being accelerated up and down as it bumps over things, or it's not quite smooth. If it was perfectly smooth, you wouldn't feel anything if the train remained perfectly at a perfectly constant velocity. And you could play golf on an airplane, you could play golf on a train as though you were on, if it's perfectly smooth, as though you were on the Earth and station with respect to the Earth, of course. But so the Earth behaves exactly like being on a train or an airplane, except that it's much smoother in its operation. So that explains all of your problems with aeroplanes and helicopters, and the gravity explains why we've got atmosphere and why the atmosphere goes round, and the viscosity of the air, because it sort of gradually speeds up. There is a gradient of speed as for instance, the top of the atmosphere is not going around with the same angular speed. I don't know if you know what angular speed is as opposed to linear speed, but the angular speed of the atmosphere, the top of the atmosphere, is not the same as the bottom. And similarly, if you actually dropped an object, for instance, if you dropped an object from about 100 meters high, due to the spinning of the Earth, we can detect it won't actually drop vertically. So, for instance, 100 meter, the 45-degree latitude, you were to drop something from a 100-meter tower, it actually comes down, I think it's 1.5 centimeters to the right, to the east, of where you dropped it. And that's because that the top of the tower is moving more quickly, because like a tire, if you can imagine a tire rotating on an axle, the center of the tire is not rotating very quickly, but the outside of the tire is. Similarly, the 100-meter height of a tower means that the top of the tower is actually moving more quickly in linear terms, but it's moving in the same angular terms, which means it's got an extra velocity. It's actually going, if you drop something at the top of this tower, it's actually moving slightly more quickly in linear terms than the bottom of the tower. And hence, when it drops down to the bottom of the tower through gravity, it actually lands not quite at the base of the tower. So all these things combined, with the viscosity, the difference in velocity, the gravity, the what's called Galilean theory of relativity, which would account for why you don't experience forces because you're not changing velocity, accounts for all of the things you've just described.
Yeah. So real quick, yeah, I think you addressed all his points. One thing if you don't mind me adding, I also think that for an isolated system, I would throw in information as well. No free exchange of energy, mass, or information across the boundary of the system.
That's a good one.
That's why I learned it. So
it sounds like we can all go home now. I believe, Wotan, you are now a globe-tard, right?
No, thank you. But I have reputation.
Wotan has a question on experiment. So Rumpus, you had plenty of time to speak. How about Wotan? You give your question about an experiment that you're looking for, give this type of parameters, and maybe he can kind of help suss that out, because you brought that up before and I don't even know what you're kind of referring to. So let me give you a few minutes to kind of explain what you mean by some kind of experiment other than like the Cavendish ones, which he already brought up, dealing with torque and stuff like that.
Take any object of any shape, of any mass, of any size, and make water levitate off it. Well, not levitate, but like float on it the way the water on the Earth is.
Okay. Right,
now with surface tension, right? Not that I'm talking about, like water with some depth around it, and the water will convey the shape of the object underneath it.
Right. This is where I might want to share a diagram here, actually, if I could.
Absolutely.
Frankie,
we love Rumpus's diagrams.
Really good. I'm glad we all like that.
They're infamous across the internet.
Yes, they are. I do seem to have quite a bit of reputation. I think several people just ask me not to. Am I going to present?
He's getting ready to share, Frankie.
Here we go. Right. So I'll just screen share this. I got on my. There we go. Share screens. And
real quick, I can't look at Frankie the same now ever since the Silent Bob reference has been made.
Well, he has like Silent Bob and Jay as a poster too, and I always kind of, thought there was a relationship there. But man, it is striking. I will give him that.
Right. So right. Can you see that?
Yes.
Great. This is the diagram that I did actually for a specific example where there's a place in the United Kingdom about 60 miles away from an island, which people have claimed demonstrated the flat Earth, but of course it didn't. And they didn't, of course, being a flat Earth, they didn't understand what up and down was all about. So this diagram is all about up and down. So I don't know how clearly you can see it, but there's a sort of model of the Earth, and it shows this is where we are at 54 degrees, or well, actually, no, slightly somewhat north of the northern part of Britain, on the surface of the Earth. And this shows you where the ups and downs are. And this is effectively what Wotan was asking about, where how come water is held down, or effectively down, goes towards the center, because of course everything goes towards the center of the earth, because that's where all the mass of the earth effectively acts mathematically as though it's actually at the center of the earth. If you do the maths, it all
so
effectively
all those points we can we'll try to break it down for like the people that are not really heavy into math and science and physics, but you're basically saying that all the points equidistant on the sphere have the same gravitational force pulling inward towards the center.
Yeah, and I've got even drawn little ups and downs on these things to show you the direction of up and down, so you don't get confused.
Center.
Yes, all going towards the center point here. And so water, just like everything else, just like stones and rocks and pencils, if you drop them, I mean, when you drop a pencil, it goes towards down, and that you'll find that's towards the center of the earth. So so the water just behaves exactly the same. And because we live on a spherical Earth, and that's where the force of gravity effectively acts from the center of the earth, everything's pulled. So a little bit of water over here at St. Bees, and it's going to be pulled just like this little bit of water down here in Australia. It's going to be pulled towards the center, and so it's going to follow the surface of the earth. And just an interesting little part of this is a scale diagram I've got here of just below that, so I'm not up down. Just below that, I have got a scale diagram of what this is what 60 miles looks like. 68 kilometers looks like on the Earth. Now, I don't know, Wotan, if you can see that, but would you say that line between this point here, which is a place called Douglas, in a place called the Isle of Man off the coast of Britain, and up here is the St. Bees place I was just talking about, and that is a scale model. This is a perfect scale model between the two with the curve of the Earth there. Would you say that line looks straight?
It does.
Great. But actually, if you zoom in here, you'll just see that in fact it isn't, and that's why you have great difficulty seeing curve, because that's actually the to scale. There's a little cliff face that I'm showing. This is the scale here of 10 kilometers at the top left. That is what the Earth looks like looking at 68 kilometers of it. So imagine you can very rarely see 68 kilometers. If your line of sight, if you were standing on the beach and looking out over the sea, was only 3 miles, and so this is why you won't be seeing curve unless you do various clever things. If you're looking along the line, I mean, if you've got a zoom camera, you can actually see the bulge here that you can see as I've zoomed in. That's about 200 or 300 meters high between those 2 points, and that's why things like boats and buildings are obscured. So a building in Douglas, or Douglas itself, in fact, actually is at ground level. And so if you're at ground level over here, you will not be able to see it because the Earth's curvature is in the way. And similarly with boats that sail over the horizon, you will then not be able to see the boat anymore because of that curve. But the curve is very gentle, and you can only see it looking across long distances. And the shot I'm showing you here is obviously a cross section. And of course, to see this, I mean, I'm effectively looking at the shot here. You'd have to be several 100 miles in space, or about 100 miles in space to get the shot you're looking at here. And of course, that's much higher than the atmosphere.
And Rumpus, also, correct me if I'm wrong, but since you're looking, if you could theoretically look in 360 degrees, because the curvature is curving at the same rate everywhere away from you, it's going to appear flat from your perspective, would it not?
Well, it appears flat across your line of vision because because you can only see 3 miles. If imagine you were standing on a beach and you're 6 feet high, the distance to the horizon is only 3 miles. Right. 3 miles, yes. So that means that you're looking across your line of vision is only 6 miles wide. That's as far. If you think of your field of view is about 45 degrees each way, so it's 90 degrees in total. You can only see about 6 miles across you. So imagine you can see here, this is the curvature I've got on screen here of 68 kilometers. So if you can only see 6 miles, which is only 10 kilometers, you're only looking at this, you're only looking down, you're seeing this bit, this tiny bit here. So of course it looks perfectly flat. But when you're looking along, so there's a big difference when you're looking along. So if you're an observer looking along the line of sight, and not trying to look left to right, but you're looking along the line of sight. And if you've got a powerful camera, you can actually see things that are, for instance, 68 kilometers away. So you can see a lot further going along the line of sight than you can going left to right. And that's why things like boats and things, you can see the dip that occurs, the curvature of the Earth.
Let me stop right there real quick, Rumpus. Let me stop right there. Well, Wotan, what do you say for what you've seen so far? He's kind of giving you a step-by-step process through this. So what are your thoughts on what you're looking at?
I asked for an experiment showing that water can conform to the exterior of a shape and convey the shape that it's conforming to, and he goes to a diagram, which is not an experiment, and he goes into mathematical jargon, and he goes into things about the curvature of the Earth. I'm not talking about the curvature of the Earth. I'm talking about you showing me an experiment.
No one's after you. No one's after you here. Relax.